Welcome Sunday school teachers and Bible study leaders to the Explore the Bible lesson overview for Ecclesiastes 1, 12 to 14 and 2, 18 to 26 for Sunday, July 25th, 2021. First of all, I just want to begin by thanking many of you who have given some positive feedback last week and over these last several weeks that these have been helpful to you. I'm thankful for that. I do pray for each one of you. Put your names in the comment section each week. I have had several say, please be sure that you do Ecclesiastes. I know it can be one of the more challenging books, and it is, but there are some great things here. Now, one of the ways that I might begin this lesson is by sharing a story like this, that a number of people were asked if you could read one book, what one book would you recommend to be read? Al Mohler, the president of our Southern Baptist Seminary, said he would recommend, if you could only read one book, that would be Augustine's Confessions. I have read it. And it is indeed an amazing testimony of how Augustine rebelled against his mother, rebelled against God, tried all kinds of worldly pleasures and philosophies until finally he was converted and came to God and became the man we know today as Saint Augustine, one of the most influential Christians and theologians in all history. But in the book, he tells the story of how he got there with all of his drinking and wrong philosophies and everything along the way. Another possible story you could begin with might be that of Anthony Flew, F-L-E-W. Flew was for much of the 20th century the foremost atheist in the world. He wrote books and did debates about how philosophically there could be no God. But I just finished reading his, what I believe is his last book, and the book is entitled, There Is a God. In 2004, he was supposed to be involved in a debate on the existence of God, but he announced at the opening of the debate that based on the existence of creation and the order that he sees in scientific laws and the complexity of DNA, he had come to the conclusion there must indeed be a mastermind in the universe, a God. And in his book, he tells the story about what he used to believe in right and how he came to believe in God. Now, the reason I might share one of these stories is that some of their pre-conversion content is something like what we might find here in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes ends in chapter 12 by saying, remember God in your youth, and our goal is to fear God and keep his commandments. But in the first part of the book, it's a lot like these men's biographies. It's a story of how they got there and some of the mistaken ideas that they had along the way. Another possible introduction for some of you country and Western fans might be the song Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places. This book is a story of a man who is looking for wisdom, who's looking for the meaning of life in all the wrong places. But he finally finds it in the end. And that's basically the story of the book of Ecclesiastes. You could introduce it in any of these ways, or maybe some other way the Lord leads you to. But the point is that similarly to the book of Job, we need to be careful and how we treat and how we quote parts of this book. Just like in Job, we need to be careful about quoting Job's friends because what they were saying was wrong. I mean, God's word is perfect, but it was perfectly recording the wrong things these men said. In the same way, we need to be careful about how we quote and how we treat some of Ecclesiastes, because a lot of what Solomon says in the book describes what he said along the path to wisdom, and especially what it looks like to a man who does not know God. For example, he repeatedly says at the beginning, all is vanity. Well, we know as Christians that's not true. We know the end of the story as he comes to chapter 12. It's not vanity to serve God. So we need to keep that in mind as we are in the first part of the book. Don't take some of these verses in the first part of Ecclesiastes for your philosophy. Someone said these first chapters of Ecclesiastes are a good description of what the world looks like to a man who does not know God. And to that kind of person, yes, all is vanity. But as we study this book as Christians today, we need to keep chapter 12's conclusion in mind. And there's some other hints to that along the way, as we'll see even today too. We don't leave Augustine in his pre-salvation days. We don't take Anthony Flew and leave him in his atheist writings, but remember how he came to see God. In the same way, we don't take all the first verses of Ecclesiastes at face value without remembering the content of the godly conclusion that he comes to at the end of the book. Hope that makes sense. because that's one of the more important things to realize about Ecclesiastes as we come to it. Much of the early chapters reflects the perspective of a person whose life is without God. But there is a life with God to be found that comes along later in the book. So be careful. Don't cherry pick some of these verses here that look very atheistic. And it's kind of what they are. It's the way life looks to a person who doesn't know God. But the final message of the book points to your need to build your life around God. So just realize that along the way, some of your members may see some of these verses and say, how could he say this? How could he say that? But just say, remember, this is the perspective, this is the way things look like to a man who does not know God, okay? Well, a little bit of background to the book you might want to do as we're starting a new book. The word Ecclesiastes is a translation of a Hebrew word that means preacher. You may know that ecclesia is in Greek means church. So the one who called to the church together is the ecclesiast, the leader of the assembly or the preacher. So this preacher is looking to make sense of life and help life make sense to us. One thing you could do as you introduce this book is to get your class to turn to verse 12 and ask them, what hints do we see in this verse as to the authorship of the book here in verse 12? Well, he says here, I'm the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. So the king over all Israel in Jerusalem wasn't David, so it's got to be Solomon. Another thing you could point out is in 1 Kings 3, Solomon had been asked by God what he wanted. He asked for wisdom. That fits with what we see in verse 13. I set my mind to seek wisdom. So again, this fits Solomon. And then a number of other things. In chapter 2, verse 1, he says he tested himself with pleasure. We know Solomon did that. Verse 8 talks about many concubines. That fits with Solomon. Chapter 2, verse 4, he enlarged his works. Solomon did that with his palace and with the temple. So there's a lot here to indicate that it was indeed Solomon who was the author of Ecclesiastes. Now this Ecclesiastes is considered to be wisdom literature. There's wisdom to be gained from reading this book. And one thing you might do at the end of every lesson is just conclude by saying, what wisdom did we learn today from this book? Because there's definitely wisdom to be found here. Now, something else you might want to mention in this first lesson, or it could even be an alternate introduction, you could ask your class, what famous verses or famous quotes can you think of that come from the book of Ecclesiastes? There are many. And if you have a class of Bible scholars, they may be able to quote several different verses from here. Chapter 1, verse 2, of course, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. There's nothing new under the sun is from chapter 1, verse 9. Chapter 3, of course, says to everything there is a season, a time to be born, a time to die. Maybe you want to have the old 1960s Birds song playing as your class comes in. Or you might save that for next week, because that chapter 3 there is next week's focal passage. So it might be good to do that then. But chapter 4, verses 9 to 11, 2 are better than 1. How can one keep warm alone? Chapter 9, verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Chapter 12, verse 1, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, and so on. Lots of good quotes in this verse. Maybe your class doesn't realize it, but there are treasures in this book to find. All right, well, getting into the text just a little bit, I would probably divide it into two main points that have the introduction, some of the things we've talked about, and then just two main points. Number one, the first thing we see here is life from the godless perspective. One of those sayings that we're so familiar with, of course, from Ecclesiastes is vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That word vanity is used 38 times in this book, so it is a major theme. It's used in a flurry in chapter 1, and then in chapter 1, verse 14 in the focus passage. The word translated vanity is the Hebrew word hebel, Hebel, which means vapor or breath. I think of James 4, where he says, our life is like a vapor that appears for a short time and then vanishes quickly away. It's like nothing. That's the way the word's often used here in Ecclesiastes. Nothing, vanity, emptiness, a breath. That's what he keeps saying. Now, I will say John MacArthur actually suggests the word can be translated three ways. Number one, as fleeting, like a vapor. Number two, futile or meaningless. Or number three, as incomprehensible. that adds a little different slant to it that you may want to look into and consider. But again, keep in mind the context. This book is not saying that everything in life is vanity. Don't take that away. Don't let your members come away taking that away from this book. He's saying that from an ungodly perspective, from the perspective of someone who doesn't know God, everything in life is useless and vain. And that is indeed the atheist perspective. If you don't believe in God, then to you everything is vanity. There is no meaning in life if there is no God. Richard E. Simmons, the third book that I've recommended to you before, Reflections on the Existence of God, he quotes the notorious atheist Richard Dawkins as saying, quote, "In this universe of blind physical forces, quote, there is at bottom no meaning, no purpose." And I've read that from many different atheists who are being honest and saying, listen, honestly, an honest atheist will tell you there is no such thing as meaning in life. If we evolved from nothing, there is no meaning. There is no purpose. You can do whatever you want to do. It doesn't matter. It's just like the preacher says here. If there's no God, then vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And the story here in the first part of Ecclesiastes is of different ways that he tried to find meaning apart from God. Now, chapter 2, verses 1 through 17 is not in the focal passage as such, but it certainly relates to it. And depending on the way your class is set up, one exercise I might do in my class is to have your class scan those 17 verses and just point out different places and different ways he searched for meaning and satisfaction apart from God. Chapter 2, verse 1 says he searched for it in pleasure. Verse 2 says he searched for it in laughter. Verse 3 says he searched for it in wine. Verse 4 in his works and buildings. Verse 5 in his gardens and parks. Verse 6 in his ponds. And on through this chapter. He tried greatness and women and pleasure and wisdom. You can just keep a list on your dry erase board or whatever. And what did he get from all of these? This takes us then to our focus passage in verse 18. He says in chapter 2, verse 18, I hated all the fruit of my labor. It didn't do for him what he wanted it to do. He says in verse 20, I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor. Now notice there was not a word about God in those first verses of this chapter up to this point. This is life from the godless perspective. Aside from the introduction, this could be point one of the lesson. This is showing life from the ungodly perspective. It is not fulfilling. Secondly, my second point would be that near the end of chapter 2, we begin to see God come into the equation in verses 24 to 26. Nothing of God in verses 1 to 23. Now in verses 24, 25, and 26, we see God in all three of these verses. Verse 24, he says, the good things in life are from the hand of God. Verse 25, he says, who can have enjoyment without him? Verse 26, he says, God gives wisdom and joy to those good in his sight. Now, somebody might say, yeah, but look, he ends that verse saying this too is vanity. But look at it closely. He's speaking about the sinful person from whom God takes everything and gives to the righteous. So yes, that sinful person's life is vanity. He is living without God. It's vain to him. But not for the person who lives with God. So I would emphasize the second point, the satisfaction of life with God in it. He's going to say more about this later in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's what Paul talks about in 1 Timothy 6, where he says, don't love money. That's the root of so much evil. But he says there is a contentment you can have with money when you know the Lord as well. He adds that factor of contentment and joy. And you may have a testimony about that, or someone else in your class you can share to that effect. Well, there's a whole lot more here. I'm trying to keep this short every week, but the bottom line is it is God who gives meaning to life. Point number one, without God, all is vanity. There's no meaning to life. Point number two, with God, there is meaning and satisfaction. We're going to see that theme all through this book, and especially in its conclusion that we'll see in a couple of weeks. Now, what I might do to wrap all this up then is close the class in prayer, but not just a perfunctory prayer. I'd focus on two things in my final prayer. Number one, I would challenge my class. Do you know somebody who is living this vanity of vanities kind of life without God. They're just living a life without God right now. Of course, they're lost. You need to pray for them. So lead your class in a time of prayer for the salvation of people that they know who are like this. And don't forget, listen, encourage them in this. God can save anybody. Remember that story of Anthony Flew. If you didn't use it in the introduction, I might use it right here in the conclusion and say, listen, God can even save the greatest atheist of the 20th century. God can save the person you're praying for. So God can save an Augustine. God can save an Anthony Flew. God can save that person that you're praying for. So encourage them to pray in faith that God can save that person that they're praying for. And then secondly, just challenge them personally. Does what we're seeing here in Ecclesiastes describe your life? Have you been trying to live without God? Have you been trying to find pleasure and joy and meaning without God? Well, you need to put your trust in Jesus as your Lord and Savior today, and use this as a time to share the gospel. As I say, have said several times, it's always good in your lessons to look for some place to share the gospel, and this is certainly a place that you could do that as you close in prayer. Give them an opportunity to pray and ask Jesus to be their Savior, and encourage them to share it with you or share it with a pastor at the end of the service that day. Well, Ecclesiastes is a very deep, very interesting, very challenging book. You may get some other things out of it in addition to what I've shared here, but I would point out that it does teach the emptiness of life without God and the satisfaction of life with Him. Remember that YouTube uses the algorithm of your likes and comments to help these videos to spread. So I encourage you, hit like, write down a comment. And I really do enjoy praying by name each Saturday and each Sunday morning for those who have left their names in the comment section, made a comment. I pray for your name. I pray for your class. So I enjoy doing that. Thank you for joining us, and God bless you as you teach His Word this Sunday.